I'd like to begin by making an apology. And I apologize for the fact that we have to do a Zoom liturgy. And that is basically because I feel so compromised that I am afraid to get COVID. It's not that I'm fearful of death. It's just that I'm having too much fun to have my ticket punched now. So, with all Zoom liturgies, we usually do them on Friday, even though most of you will be seeing them on Sunday morning. And because it is Friday and it is 9/11, I would like to say to anybody who has lost somebody on 9/11, whether it be a family member or a friend, our prayers are with you. It has been 19 years since that day that we suffered that tragedy that brought our country together. To begin, I want to also welcome some new members. Donna has told me that the last few Sundays we've had over 200 people sign into Zoom or into our liturgy. And that is far more than we used to have on a good Sunday and Saturday night. And she also informs me that our parishioner rolls have increased to almost 300. So in saying that, I also want to, some of you do not know who I am. And so I just wanted to introduce the way that I preach. I preach with nuggets. All right, they're not chicken nuggets. All right, but I consider them just lumps. And after I finish preaching, you are the ones who decide whether the lump is of gold or of cold. If it's gold, you can take it with you. If it's cold, you just throw it away. Now to begin, my first nugget this morning is, and the old-time parishioners are going to get tired of this, but it's my favorite. It's from Julian of Norwich. And Julian of Norwich lived in the 1200s and early 1300s. And she was an anchoress. In other words, she was like a hermit, but instead of going out into the wilderness, she had a room in the church where she stayed for her whole life. And she had a window in that room so that she could participate in the liturgy, but she stayed in that room for the rest of her life because that was her vow. Now, one of the things that Julian of Norwich said was that God's love for us is so intense that there is nothing that we can do that will either increase it or decrease it. And that's basically what Jesus was trying to tell us in this morning's gospel, is that God has tremendous forgiveness. His love for us forgives everything. Now, when we look at the gospel, we ask ourselves, well, you know, that is Jesus's message, but did he live his own message? And we know that he did, because all we have to do is look at the crucifix. He gave it his all. Now, some might say that he was forced into crucifixion because he was arrested the night before and had no choice. But I would rather say that Jesus had a choice as soon as he began his public ministry. Now, some gospel writers say that his public ministry lasted for a year. Others say that it lasted 3 years. But that's really immaterial. It's what went on before he started his public ministry. We know from the gospel story that Jesus would always go off by himself, many times a day sometimes, to pray and meditate. And we have to imagine that Jesus did that throughout his life. It wasn't something that he just started to do during his public ministry. And in doing that, Jesus thought and prayed and meditated on the tremendous love of his Father. And he felt compelled to tell the Jewish people how much his Father loved them. And so began his public ministry. Now, to think that Jesus knew that he was going to be crucified because his divine nature let him see into the future would be a mistake. Because we need Jesus to be fully human. We do not need Jesus to be seeing visions from his divine nature. But Jesus knew, all right, that the path that he was taking was going to lead to crucifixion. And how did he know that? Well, we have to assume that when Jesus began his public ministry at 30 years old, that the army of the Romans who dominated the Jews at that time would not abide by any insurrection or any anarchy. And so Jesus must have witnessed during his 30 years other insurrectionists and other anarchists being crucified. And he knew that the Romans had spies, because that's the only way that they could keep track of anarchists. And he knew that in his followers, there were bound to be Roman spies. And he knew that the closer that he got to Jerusalem, the bigger his crowds were, and the more worried the Romans became. At any point during his public ministry, he could have said to himself, "This is too much, I can't do this," and he would have just left. But he didn't. And he knew that his triumphal entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday would have been the straw that broke the camel's back. And sure enough, it was during that following week that he himself was crucified. And we know, as Drew said, on many occasions, he left nothing in the tank. He gave it all. And that is a word that we use as kenosis, all right, which means that there is nothing at all left in the tank. And we also know that with his dying breath, he said, "Father, forgive them." Now, we know what Jesus was all about. And yet what I tried to do is look for some earthly being that has lived Jesus's life. Somebody that we can use as a model. And fortunately and unfortunately, somebody came to my mind almost immediately. All right, because we just buried him a few weeks ago. When I was in my warm seminary room in the beautiful Allegheny Mountains of southern New York, there was a 25-year-old Baptist minister who was leading a group of people, a lot of whom were clergymen from other religions, and he was leading them across a bridge. And he was saying later that he was pretty sure that he was going to die on that day. And in case he didn't die, the worst that was going to happen to him was going to be that he was going to be beaten and thrown into jail. Now, interestingly enough, everybody has seen the picture of him walking across that bridge, but he was carrying a backpack. And people later asked him what was in that backpack. And it was only recently that he told people what was in the backpack. And it was a container of water, an apple, and a book. And the book that he brought with him on that occasion was a book about Thomas Merton, a Roman Catholic Trappist monk, all right, who later became a mystic of the church. I find that extremely interesting because when I was in the seminary, we were told not to read theologians from other religions. And yet here was this Baptist minister who was reading a book about a Catholic monk. Well, it so happens that he came within an inch of his life. They fractured his skull, but he survived. And he lived the rest of his life not only forgiving those, all right, who beat him severely, but living a life, all right, of forgiveness and kinesis. That person, I'm sure that you recognize, is none other than John Lewis. Now, John Lewis just died recently after he was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. And I would be one of those people who, if I was diagnosed and given a short time to live, I would dust off my bucket list, all right, and see if I could cram in as much as I could in the short time that I had. John Lewis didn't do that. John Lewis continued living his life of forgiveness and Christian living up until the moment that he could no longer not be bedridden. And I have to say, with a sad heart, it was a sad day when John Lewis was buried, for me personally. And I did not know who could take his place. And just last week, I turned on the TV, and there was a group of reporters interviewing a woman, and they weren't identifying the woman. She was black, and she wasn't Oprah Winfrey, or she wasn't Octavia Spencer, and I had never seen her before. And then they identified her at the bottom as Julia Jackson. And Julia Jackson, before this crowd of reporters, was saying, "I am a black woman and I am beautiful." And then she said, "Look at your hand." And I looked at my hand and she said, "It's amazing." And then she said, "It doesn't matter what color it is, it's just amazing." And then she said, "Look at all the trees around, all shades of green, some with a red tint, some with an orange tint, but they're all beautiful." And then she said, "Look at the birds. Every color imaginable you can find in birds of the world, and they are all beautiful." And then she said, why is it that only human beings with white skin are beautiful? And then she walked off the camera. And later that day, the story is told that Julia Jackson went to a hospital room to visit her son. Her son was fighting for his life. He was already paralyzed from the waist down. And because of old warrants, even though he was paralyzed, his ankle was shackled to the bed. And there was a police officer in his room to make sure that he did not run away. Julia Jackson in that room went up to her son and said, would you like to pray? And her son said, yes. And then Julia Jackson did a remarkable thing. She went over to the police officer and she said, are you a man of faith? And the police officer said, yes. And she said, would you please pray with my son and me? And all three of them prayed. Julia Jackson's son is Jacob Blake. We all know him from Kenosha. Later on, a few days later, Julia Jackson again visited her son, and a crowd of reporters said, you know, what did you do with your son? And she said, we prayed. And Julia Jackson, they asked Julia Jackson, well, what did you pray for? And Julia Jackson said, well, I prayed for my son that he would heal and get well. And I also prayed for the officer who shot him in the back. To me, all right, although I do not believe and never have believed in reincarnation, somehow I believe that Julia Jackson is following John Lewis's footsteps. How could a woman forgive the way that she has forgiven? Unless she experiences kinesis. So for me, Julia Jackson is the kinesis in Kenosha. So having experienced and having seen Jesus the way that he preached about God's forgiveness, and that he was able to forgive on the cross, and to see human beings like John Lewis and Julia Jackson forgive, I have to ask myself, because one of the things that Julia Jackson said was that I am asking every police officer, every fireman, every politician, and every clergy person to look into their hearts. And I took her at her word, and I had to look into my heart. And when I did so, I found that I had hatred for somebody that has existed for 7 years. 7 years from an old neighbor that both of us 70 years old. The day that I sold my house in Maine, we almost had fisticuffs over a border. And I have to confront that. I have to do something about that because of today's gospel, because of the example of John Lewis, all right, and Julia Jackson. And all I would say is that, leave you with this message. Is there anybody in your life that you have to forgive? Namaste.